Do you still believe Merlin is the great advisor with a magic staff turning the tides of fate? The man who lit the way for King Arthur? Ridiculous, really? Because the original prototype of this icon of wisdom was actually a ragged psychopath, twitching in the forest due to post-traumatic stress disorder after a horrific massacre. Before being whitewashed to become the venerable white-bearded old man in Disney movies, Merlin, or more accurately, Murden Wilt, was just a defeated man who chose to go mad to escape the brutal reality of the 6th century. But you know, history is a skillful and hypocritical tailor. To legitimize dynasties built on blood and betrayal, people needed a name with a touch of the divine. So they began cooking the story, adding an incubus demon as a father to explain his extraordinary powers, but then stuffing in a nun for a mother and a hurried baptism to keep him from being burned by the church. So, what really lies behind that mystical velvet curtain? A prophet who saw through time, or just a brilliant media product painted by historians to lead the masses by the nose for centuries? Let's peel back that glamorous velvet layer. I am Zorro, and welcome to Dark History. Imagine a thick, foggy morning in 6th century Wales. The Roman Empire has withdrawn, leaving a massive power vacuum, and Britain at that time was like a piece of bait, torn apart by Saxon swords and endless civil wars. In that chaos of blood and dust, a silhouette begins to emerge from the mist. We call him Merlin. But I want you to forget the image of the silver-haired old man in a sparkling blue robe from Disney cartoons. The truth, as always, is much darker and harsher. Before becoming a high-tier sorcerer, Merlin was a schizophrenic wandering in the forest. His real name was Murden Wilt, or Wild Merlin, and his life didn't begin with magic, but with a nightmare. In 573 AD, the Battle of Arfderydd broke out. Imagine it. The sound of clashing metal, blood-curdling screams, and the thick stench of death. Amidst the ruins of the Celtic kingdoms, Murden witnessed his comrades and brothers being slaughtered before his very eyes. An extreme psychological shock snapped his mind. Murden didn't choose to die heroically on the battlefield. He chose to run. He plunged into the Caledonian forest, living like an animal, eating roots, sleeping in caves, and talking to beasts. But it was here, in the deep pit of madness, that something strange sprouted. The Celts had a very interesting concept. They believed in the inspired madman. When you lose your link to mundane reality, your mind opens doors to another world. Murden's madness was the price paid for supernatural clairvoyance. He began to see what others could not, hearing the whispers of the future in the wind blowing through the leaves. The forest wasn't just a refuge. It was a dark cathedral where the line between man and God became as thin as a hair. You see, Merlin wasn't naturally gifted. He had to trade his sanity for bitter prophecies about the fate of the Welsh people and the fall of the invaders. But let's stop for a moment. Was Merlin really a single man, or was he just a perfect marketing product molded from many different historical puzzle pieces? To understand Merlin, we must look at his predecessors in the Mabinogian epic. These were sorcerers like Mathfab Mathonwy, a man so powerful he had to rest his feet in the lap of a virgin to maintain his strength unless there was a war, or Gwydion, the master of illusions, who could create a whole army from mushrooms and turn flowers into a beautiful woman. It sounds romantic, but look deeper. Celtic magic wasn't about waving a wand and shouting slogans. It was a profound understanding of the hidden laws of nature. And who held those secrets? The Druids. Julius Caesar, a man who didn't much care for barbarians, had to admit that this Druid intellectual class was extremely formidable. They spent 20 years of their lives just memorizing thousands of verses, laws, and philosophies. They didn't need books. Their brains were massive libraries. With knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, they could predict solar and lunar eclipses and the changing of seasons. In the eyes of the illiterate masses back then, knowing when the sun would disappear was clearly dark magic, right? The Druids weren't just priests. They were political advisors with ultimate power. They could stop a war just by stepping between two armies lined up for battle. This is the historical skeleton upon which the image of Merlin was fleshed out, a combination of scholarly knowledge and terrifying supernatural power. And then, history took a spectacular turn when it merged Myrddin Wyllt, the madman in the woods, with Ambrosius Aurelianus, a decisive military commander of Roman descent. This molding created Myrddin Emrys. Now, Merlin was no longer just a hermit muttering to himself. He had become a composite character, possessing both the clairvoyance of a prophet and the acumen of a political architect. He began to appear in the earliest records of Nennius as a fatherless boy. When King Vortigern tried to build a fortress on Snowdon, but found that whatever was built collapsed, Merlin appeared. The king's sorcerers, incompetent men afraid for their lives, suggested that the blood of a fatherless child must be used as a sacrifice for the foundation. A bloody and superstitious idea, wouldn't you agree? But the boy Merlin laughed at them. He didn't point out a technical flaw in the construction. He pointed to a secret deep underground, an underground lake where two dragons, one red, one white, were fighting to the death. The battle of these two legendary creatures was the reason the ground shook. In that moment, Merlin broke the fourth wall of reality. He wasn't just solving a construction problem. He was drawing a map of destiny for an entire nation. The red dragon was the British. The white dragon was the Saxons. That underground battle was a prophecy of a future full of blood and tears that Britain was about to endure. From a madman fleeing war, Merlin became the shaper of history. But this was only the beginning. The story of how he was born from a lustful demon and how he stole a giant circle of stones from Ireland to Britain, that's when things get truly bizarre. Have you ever wondered why Merlin knew everything? From who would take the throne in the future to what was happening across the ocean? The answer doesn't lie in him being a diligent student. It lies in the genetic code. But instead of a normal father, Merlin had a dad from hell. Welcome to the darkest corner of this wizard's resume. His origin from an incubus. In medieval theology, an incubus was a type of lustful demon, a fallen angel who still retained a genius brain and the ability to manipulate matter. And this demon dad chose a target that couldn't be more ironic. A pure nun living in a convent. Imagine this scene. Amidst the scent of incense and prayers, a plume of black smoke snakes into that poor woman's dreams. The result of this sinful visit was a child possessing all the wisdom of hell, but the heart of a human. I know what you're thinking. So Merlin is a demon in human skin? Not quite. The writers of that time quickly released a very timely spiritual patch: baptism. As soon as Merlin was born, he was taken to be baptized. This ritual was like a factory reset, stripping away his demonic evil nature, but generously leaving behind all the superpowers like prophecy and clairvoyance. A perfect combination, the wisdom of a demon serving the purpose of God. A classic theological loophole, isn't it? And this child was not normal. While other babies were still crawling and drooling, Merlin could speak clearly like a philosopher and see through the secrets that adults tried to hide. His eyes didn't look at you, they looked through you, seeing even the sins you hadn't yet committed. But Merlin's talent truly came to light thanks to a desperate king, Vortigern. Vortigern was a traitor, a usurper trembling before the Saxon expansion. He tried to build an impregnable fortress on Snowdon to save his life, but every night, the massive stone walls collapsed like a sandcastle. Desperate and superstitious, Vortigern turned to his court sorcerers, and guess what these experts suggested? Find a child who has no earthly father, kill him, and mix his blood into the mortar. Only the blood of a supernatural being will keep this fortress standing. What a humane medieval solution. And Merlin, the son of an incubus, was the perfect target. When the soldiers brought Merlin before the king, instead of crying and pleading, this 12-year-old boy looked straight at the court sorcerers and laughed at their ignorance. Merlin said, "You want my blood? Don't waste your breath. You don't know why the walls fall because you can't see past your own noses." Merlin led the king to the base of the fortress and ordered them to dig deep into the ground. And this was the most cinematic moment of his life. Beneath the earth and rock was a dark underground lake. When the water was drained, 2 giant dragons, one red, one white, emerged and immediately locked in a world-shaking battle to the death. Fire scorched the night sky, and roars shook the mountains and forests. The white dragon, representing the Saxons, initially dominated, but the red dragon, representing the native Britons, finally turned the tide. Merlin wasn't just solving a construction problem, he was performing a live stream of Britain's future. He told Vortigern a bitter truth. This fortress would never protect him, because the white dragon was gnawing at the kingdom from within, and a true king, the red dragon, would soon appear to claim justice. That was when the name Merlin, Latinized from Murden by Geoffrey of Monmouth to avoid confusion with the Latin word for feces, a very subtle PR crisis management move, officially entered history. He was no longer a scapegoat. He had become the architect of destiny. But Merlin didn't just know how to prophesy with words. He could also move mountains. Have you ever heard about him stealing Stonehenge from Ireland using just a few mechanical tricks? And more importantly, his darkest plan to create the greatest king in history, Arthur, was about to begin with a high-level romantic scam. If you think Merlin was a saint who only cared about the nation's destiny, then sorry, I have to disappoint you. Merlin was actually a professional fixer, a man willing to get his hands dirty in the filthiest plots to achieve his ultimate goal. And his most famous job? Turning a royal affair into the birth of a legend. It all began with Uther Pendragon, a king with a hot head and a heart full of lust. Uther was obsessed with Igraine, the wife of Duke Gorlois of Cornwall. Imagine this. Uther didn't just want to take her, he was mad for her. This obsession was so great it threatened to topple the newly formed kingdom. Duke Gorlois was no pushover. He immediately took his wife and hid her away in Tintagel Castle. And this is where the movie set gets dramatic. Tintagel Castle sat on a rocky outcrop jutting into the sea, with only a single path so narrow 3 men couldn't walk abreast. It was an impregnable fortress. Uther could send tens of thousands of troops, but he would only meet failure. When the army was stuck, that's when magic, or rather Merlin's cunning, spoke up. I must say, Merlin's plan was both genius and cruel. He didn't break down the walls, he broke reality. Merlin used a magical potion, or perhaps high-level hypnosis, to transform Uther's appearance. Suddenly, the king was no longer Uther. He had the face, the voice, and even the characteristic gestures of Gorlois. Merlin also didn't forget to touch up himself and another courtier to impersonate the Duke's confidants. And so, the gates of Tintagel opened. Igraine welcomed her husband back on a stormy night, completely unaware she was embracing an imposter. Meanwhile, on another battlefield not far away, the real Gorlois was dying under the swords of Uther's army. Do you see the bitter irony here? At the very moment Arthur, the future king of righteousness, was conceived, his biological father was carrying out a romantic scam over the corpse of his rival. Merlin stood there in the shadows of the castle corridors, watching it all. To him, morality was a luxury. His ultimate goal was to create a powerful royal bloodline, and if the price was a disguised rape and betrayal, he was ready to sign that contract. But Merlin wasn't just good at manipulating people. He was also a superb engineer with impossible projects. Have you ever wondered how the giant stones of Stonehenge appeared in Salisbury? According to our records, Merlin was the one who transported it. But don't imagine him waving a wand and making stones fly through the sky. Historia Regum Britannia tells us that these stones, called the Giant's Dance, were originally far away in Ireland. When King Aurelius wanted to build a monument for the massacred nobles, 15,000 soldiers tried to pull those stones, but they wouldn't budge. Merlin stood aside, watching them sweat and bleed, and smiled softly. He said, "Use wisdom instead of muscle." By using strange mechanical designs and an understanding of gravity that people at the time called magic, Merlin dismantled and transported those giant stone blocks across the sea. To me, this is the most interesting detail. Merlin wasn't just a wizard. He represented the forgotten scientific wisdom of the ancient world. He understood levers, pulleys, and the physical laws that the illiterate warriors around him considered the miracles of a demon. By the time Stonehenge was erected, Merlin had proven to the world, knowledge is the ultimate power. He could create a king from a lie and build an eternal monument from the immovable. But every power has a weakness, and Merlin's Achilles' heel was the very thing he helped Uther satisfy: love. The man who deceived the whole world was eventually deceived by a young girl. Do you want to know how the greatest wizard in history ended his life in a prison without bars? After molding Arthur from a shocking fraud, Merlin didn't exactly retire. On the contrary, he became the brain behind the throne of Camelot. But make no mistake, Merlin wasn't a devoted prime minister. He was like a director controlling a play for which he already knew the ending. In Arthur's court, Merlin embodied wisdom ahead of its time. He taught Arthur not by waving a wand to destroy enemies, but by teaching the young king to understand the cycles of power. You see, Merlin's magic at this stage had evolved into a terrifying political philosophy. He understood Awen, the divine inspiration of the Celts, an energy that made people tremble and speak in different voices. Merlin didn't just see the future. He felt the pulse of the country through every season, from dawn to dusk. But life always saves the most ironic scripts for those who boast they can control destiny. Meet Vivienne, or Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. If Merlin was an old, world-weary university professor, Vivienne was a genius student with a cold ambition. Merlin, the man who had seen through thousands of plots, the man who turned Uther into someone else to violate a woman, finally fell into the very trap he once set: lust. How ridiculous. A prophet who could foresee the fall of kingdoms, yet was blind to the beauty of a young girl. Merlin was so infatuated with Vivienne that he was willing to trade all his ultimate secrets just for one of her smiles. He taught her how to control the elements, how to seal spirits, and how to create unbreakable prisons. And Vivienne, an excellent student, practiced her final lesson on her own teacher. There are many versions of Merlin's end. Some say she used magic to lock him in a glass tower. Others say a cold stone cave. But I prefer the most Celtic image: Merlin imprisoned forever inside an ancient tree. Imagine it, the greatest wizard in history, the man who once moved Stonehenge, now stuck inside rough tree bark, his soul dissolving into the sap and the rustling of leaves. He is still there, still seeing the future, still hearing the footsteps of history, but never able to intervene again. It is a symbolic punishment, the worshipper of nature finally swallowed by nature itself. So, what do we learn from this magical detective? Merlin isn't just a fictional character. He is a combination of the traumatic memory of the Welsh, the scholarly wisdom of the Druids, and the political ambition of the Middle Ages. Through the molding of Geoffrey of Monmouth, Merlin transformed from a madman in the woods into a symbol of the complex relationship between knowledge and power. We need Merlin to explain the inexplicable. We need him to believe that behind every great king, there is always a wise, and sometimes cruel, figure pulling the strings. Merlin is a reminder. Wisdom can build empires and move mountains, but without sanity in the face of mundane human instincts, even a supreme wizard is just a prisoner of himself. The legend of Merlin will live on, not because of his magic, but because of the contradictions he represents. Between madness and genius, between light and shadow, between reality and dreams. And now, as the fog begins to cover the stones of Stonehenge again, I wonder, has Merlin truly disappeared? Or is he still watching us from inside those ancient trees, waiting for another red dragon to rise? Imagine this setting: 5th century Britain, a land torn apart by bloody Saxon swords and greedy local tyrants. Vortigern, the man sitting in the hot seat, is trembling because the tower he intends to build collapses every night. The useless court wizards, in a desperate attempt to keep their heads, gave a dark history-style piece of advice: find a fatherless child, kill him, and sprinkle his blood on the tower's foundation. But Merlin, that fatherless child, didn't come to be a sacrifice. He came to change the game. Instead of crying, Merlin pointed to the ground and challenged those frauds. Underneath there are 2 dragons fighting. That is why the tower falls. And when the earth cracked open, revealing a red dragon and a white dragon locked in a death match, the entire court fell silent. The white dragon represented the Saxon invaders, those who were pouring in like a flood. The red dragon was the native Britons. Merlin prophesied, although the red dragon is currently overwhelmed, one day a great leader from Cornwall, bearing the symbol of the bear, will appear to sweep away the enemy. You see, Merlin wasn't just fortune-telling. He was dispensing hope, a weapon sharper than any sword in the Dark Ages. But what makes the difference between a quack and a true master? Its results. While the court sorcerers only knew how to mutter meaningless ancient formulas, Merlin controlled the elements as if they were chess pieces on a board. Historical records say he could summon storms to clear the sky for astronomical observation, or turn parched lands into babbling brooks. Most special was his ability to shapeshift. Do you think that was magic to turn into a rabbit or a bird for amusement? No, you're dead wrong. For Merlin, shapeshifting was the art of adaptation. For those who needed wisdom, he appeared as a wise old man. For the innocent, he was a playful child. In court reports, he was seen turning into an ordinary servant to sneak through forbidden areas, gathering intelligence that no one could suspect. Sometimes he took the form of a bird to observe the battlefield from above. Merlin's magic always had a clear political purpose. Information is power. The source of his power wasn't something normal people could access either. Merlin didn't learn from books or magic schools. Medieval sources describe him receiving instruction from entities in the afterlife during dreams. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, all were downloaded into Merlin's head like high-end software that mortals would take a lifetime to understand. Merlin's rise created an earthquake at court. The old sorcerers, those who survived through favor and tricks, began to feel their seats wobble. They accused him of being the son of a demon, a sower of corruption. But Merlin only smiled. As his prophecies began to come true one by one, and as his virtue remained unshakable, the detractors had no choice but to bow or disappear into the shadows of history. Britain at that time stood at a crossroads. Vortigern's chaotic reign was ending, and a unified kingdom needed an architect. Merlin decided. He would not just be an advisor on the sidelines. He would be the kingmaker. He would orchestrate the ascension of Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father, using a blend of political clairvoyance and supreme elemental magic. But Vortigern's death was only the beginning of a new crisis. The Saxons were like a pack of wolves waiting at the border, while native rulers were busy tearing each other apart. Who would be the one to heal these fragments? Merlin chose Uther, but putting a warrior on the throne in a divided society required more than muscle. It required a symbol. And that was when Merlin looked up at the sky, waiting for a comet in the shape of a dragon. Let's be honest with each other. History isn't written in ink. It's written in blood and elaborately staged lies. After Vortigern's shadow dissipated, Britain was like a rudderless ship in a Saxon storm. Aurelius Ambrosius, a promising commander of Roman descent, had just managed to clear the rubble when, suddenly, he was poisoned. Abrupt, cold, and incredibly convenient for a new script that Merlin was nurturing. This power vacuum was the stage for Merlin to move his most important pawn into position, Uther, Aurelius's younger brother. But the problem was, the British nobility at that time were like a pack of stray cats. No one would submit to another. Uther had the noble blood and the military skills, but he lacked one thing: divine approval. And in an era where people believed in omens more than diplomatic evidence, Merlin played his trump card. Boom! A dragon-shaped comet blazed across the sky the moment Aurelius died. Merlin appeared instantly, his voice echoing like a prophecy. "It is the sign! The gods have chosen Uther!" This wasn't just a prophecy, my friends. This was a masterclass in rebranding. Uther was granted the title Pendragon, head of the dragon. The dragon wasn't just a fire-breathing monster. In Celtic culture, it was the link between the land and the sovereignty. By attaching Uther's name to this symbol, Merlin transformed a crude warrior into a legitimate son of heaven. But Merlin didn't stop there. Uther's coronation wasn't held in a cramped church. No, he took it to Stonehenge. Imagine it. Amidst those giant, ancient, mysterious blocks that Merlin himself had transported in the previous reign, Uther stood, a cunning blend of Christian ritual with bishops praying and pre-Christian rites with ancient weapons and the call of the land spirits. Merlin was playing a multi-platform game, ensuring that whether you were a devout believer or a nature worshiper, you had to kneel before this king. However, ruling a country isn't just a theatrical performance. The Saxons were no longer just petty raiders. They had begun building permanent settlements and organizing professional armies. Britain's obsolete tribal system, where every petty king managed his own backyard, was being crushed. Merlin forced Uther to reform, establishing a centralized command structure. To do that, the wizard had to negotiate with each regional lord, men who always had their own local league sorcerers ready to stab Merlin in the back. But with real power, Merlin silenced them all. And then, we come to the darkest and most controversial chapter in Merlin's career: the scandal at Cornwall. Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall, was a stubborn man who held the island's most important tin mines. He had an impregnable fortress called Tintagel, and more importantly, he had a stunning wife, Igraine. Uther, instead of focusing on driving out the Saxons, was consumed by lust for Igraine. A civil war over a woman? That's a political disaster. But for Merlin, it was an opportunity. The deception at Tintagel Castle wasn't a cheap magic trick. It was magical manipulation at an atomic level. Merlin didn't just make Uther look like Gorlois. He created a replica so perfect it was terrifying. The voice, the demeanor, the private memories, the smallest details of the bedroom, everything was programmed into Uther by Merlin. While the real Gorlois was dying on the battlefield at a moment, Merlin calculated down to the second. The fake Gorlois, meaning Uther, was in the bedroom with Igraine. The result of that night of deception was Arthur. Do you see Merlin's ruthlessness here? He let Gorlois die, let Igraine be deceived, and let Uther satisfy his lust, all just to create a child who inherited both Uther's royal blood and Cornwall's strategic assets. Merlin turned a filthy affair into a divine destiny. He convinced public opinion that Arthur's conception was God's arrangement, not the craving of a king and the manipulation of a wizard. But Merlin didn't let Arthur grow up in the silk of the court, a place full of assassination plots and corruption. He took the child to Sir Ector, an upright nobleman in a remote countryside. Arthur grew up as an anonymous knight, learning to ride, sword fight, and live as a normal human being. Merlin frequently disguised himself and sneaked off to visit his greatest project, ensuring that Arthur was not just physically strong, but also had a clearer head than his father. All these arrangements pointed toward a single goal, a performance that would change history forever: a sword, an anvil, and a stone in London. Merlin had already prepared the software for that sword. It would only respond to Arthur's specific genetic code. When Arthur pulled the sword, to the astonishment of the entire country, it wasn't luck. It was Merlin's masterpiece, a perfect combination of magical mechanical engineering and crowd psychology. But can a kingdom built on deception and magic stand firm? Or will those very powers become the shackles for Merlin himself? Welcome to Merlin's laboratory. You know, while contemporary wizards were busy with stinking potions or half-baked spells, Merlin was operating on a completely different level. If I had to use a modern term, I'd call Merlin a systems engineer of reality. His magic wasn't cheap stage tricks. It was a sophisticated synthesis of classical knowledge, natural philosophy, and a supernatural upgrade from his demonic blood. Merlin's ability to prophesy wasn't like the hit-or-miss predictions of some tarot card reader. Medieval records describe his visions as comprehensive revelations. Merlin didn't just see an event. He saw the entire source code of history, the political, spiritual, and military forces intertwining. To access this network, Merlin often retreated to desolate places like caves or forest clearings, where the boundaries between dimensions were thinnest. Witnesses recounted that during his trances, Merlin's eyes glowed like embers, and his voice carried a timbre that didn't belong to this world. He didn't just see the future, he lived in it, gathering tactical intelligence for tomorrow's battles and strategies for centuries to come. Forget sword fights. Merlin fought with tropical depressions. His mastery over the elements allowed him to sense atmospheric changes days in advance. In life-or-death battles against the Saxons, Merlin often summoned sudden storms to blind the enemy or dissipated fog to reveal their ambush positions. But Merlin didn't just use weather for killing. He was a magical economist. By ensuring perfect rainfall for the planting season and preventing storms during harvest, he created a golden age of agriculture for Arthur. You see, the people's loyalty didn't just come from the crown. It came from their stomachs being constantly full, thanks to the wizard's intervention. When Merlin built Camelot, he wasn't just stacking stones. He was designing a secure operating system for an entire kingdom. Merlin's architectural magic was a combination of Roman engineering and multi-layered protection charms. Outer perimeter, a supernatural early warning system. Any hostile army or assassination plot was scanned by Merlin from miles away. Adaptive environment. Roads to the castle could become winding to confuse enemies, yet straight and easy for those with good intentions. Magic-absorbing walls. The stones of Camelot were enchanted to absorb and neutralize hostile spells, and the heart of this fortress was the Round Table. This wasn't just a wooden table, it was a socio-psychological regulation device. Merlin chose an old oak from a sacred forest, carving it into a mandala shape to eliminate all power hierarchies. But the secret lay in the enchantment. The table's surface would grow warm when a knight spoke the truth, and ice cold when someone was hiding personal agendas. It was a giant lie detector, forcing the knights to live by the highest moral standards. In an era where the church could burn anyone associated with demons, Merlin performed a spectacular whitewash. He never called his magic sorcery. He called it natural magic, a type of science based on understanding the laws of God and the universe. He convinced theologians that, despite his demonic blood, through his baptism and service to Britain's destiny, he had converted dark powers into divine tools. It was a genius PR move. Merlin transformed himself from a suspect into an irreplaceable supernatural philosopher. However, there was one thing even Merlin's OS couldn't fully predict: the human heart. While magic had erected the strongest walls, it was the internal cracks, betrayal, lust, and the women in Merlin's life that would begin to trigger a self-destruct command that no spell could stop. The fall didn't begin with a Saxon army. It began with the eyes of a woman named Nimue. Do you know what's most ironic about smart people? They always think they can control every variable except one: the weariness of their own soul. After building an empire, turning an anonymous boy into a legendary king, and launching Britain onto a brilliant pedestal, Merlin began to feel the weight of time. The demonic blood in him made him immortal, but it didn't save him from the loneliness of someone standing too high. And that was when Nimue, also known as Vivian, appeared. She wasn't a Saxon army, nor was she a fierce dragon. She was just a young, beautiful girl with a thirst for knowledge, the perfect bait for a master seeking a successor. I, Zorro, have a theory. Merlin wasn't tricked at all. With a prophecy that could see through centuries, how could he not know he was teaching his own executioner? Merlin taught Nimue everything: how to control the elements, how to seal realities, and the binding spells that no power could break. Perhaps he was simply too tired of cleaning up humanity's wreckage. He wanted rest, even if the price was an eternal grave. The end played out like a dark drama. In the forest of Brocéliande, Nimue used the very spell Merlin taught her to seal him inside an old oak tree, or according to some other sources, a glass tomb or a cold limestone cave. Merlin, the man who could summon storms, the man who moved Stonehenge, now lay still in a trap of his own design. And look what happened to Camelot when its brain vanished. Without Merlin's guidance, the cracks he once tried to mend began to rip wide open. Lancelot and Guinevere's lust, Morgan Le Fay's hatred, and the rise of Mordred, all like an unstoppable chain reaction. Camelot fell not because the Saxons were too strong, but because they lost the only person who could see the chess pieces before they were moved. Merlin's death, or imprisonment, is the deepest lesson in this dark history series. A system, no matter how perfect, will collapse if it relies solely on the will of a single individual. Merlin tried to create an ideal world through magic and manipulation, but he forgot that humans always have a tendency to destroy the best things they have. Arthur finally threw Excalibur back into the lake, marking the end of a magical era. But Merlin is still there, somewhere deep underground, in his fateful sleep. Some say he will return when Britain needs him most, but I think differently. Perhaps he's sitting in his glass tomb, smiling ironically and wondering, next time, should I choose a king with fewer problems? I hope you enjoyed this journey into the mind of history's greatest wizard. Don't forget, history is never just black or white. It's a dense gray of plots and power. You think Merlin was a long-bearded old man in a blue dress carrying a wooden staff for walks in the woods? Oh, throw that Disney image away immediately. In reality, in the eyes of medieval scholars, Merlin was more like a mad scientist than a fairy. He possessed what people called transcendent wisdom, a type of psychic ability that allowed him to understand universal principles that we mortal masses are usually clueless about. Imagine it like this. To an illiterate person back then, a doctor curing a disease with medicine looked no different from a miracle. Merlin was the same. He didn't work magic through hope and faith. He worked magic through knowledge. And his greatest project? A weapon we still call Excalibur. Don't let the folk songs fool you into thinking this sword was simply pulled from a stone or handed over by some lady under the water. Merlin forged it, and he didn't use cheap steel taken from some local mines. Excalibur's steel came from meteorites, iron blocks that fell from the heavens. I want you to visualize this setting: a pitch-black night, constellations aligned in a rare astronomical configuration, the moment Merlin believed cosmic forces were opening the gates. He stood there, along with a master blacksmith, who was probably scared to death, sweating over the furnace. This process wasn't just banging a hammer on iron. It was a ritual coordinating peak craftsmanship and supernatural blessing. It took months of preparation just to wait for the exact moment the stars blessed the metal. Why go to such lengths? Because Merlin didn't just want to create a sharp sword, he wanted to create an early version of biometric security. Have you ever wondered why no enemy could use Excalibur against Arthur? Simple. Merlin programmed a variable weight into the sword. In Arthur's hand, it was as light as a feather, so sharp it could cut through the void. But if you, someone without legitimate authority, tried to lift it, it would be as heavy as a mountain, sluggish and useless. A perfect succession test, and also a high-level political trick to turn Arthur into an untouchable god. But listen, here's the interesting part. Few people notice: the scabbard. Most of us go crazy for the shimmering blade, but Merlin knew that offense was only half the game. Excalibur's scabbard was the real game hack. The spells woven into its leather and metal created an automatic defense field. Arrows flying in, deflected, an enemy blade slashing, pushed aside. It made the wearer nearly invincible without spending an ounce of energy. And Merlin didn't stop there. His Camelot was like a high-tech surveillance center. He had a staff carved from the world tree, inlaid with a crystal containing captured starlight to see through the future. He had enchanted mirrors, the predecessors of CCTV and Zoom systems, allowing him to monitor every corner of the kingdom and communicate with allies from afar. There is an extremely hypocritical distinction here. I want you to notice. Merlin called what he did white magic because it followed nature and protected social order. but others doing the same thing? That was sorcery, deception, and the devil. The winner is always the one who writes the definition of morality, right? Merlin didn't just create a king. He created a power system based on a monopoly of knowledge and technology that he labeled as holy. That's how Camelot began, not with peace, but with the absolute dominance of magical artifacts. But can a kingdom built on supernatural toys last forever? Or will the knights Merlin trained be the ones to destroy it with their own hands? We'll find out in the next part, when the architect of Camelot begins his game of human governance. After equipping Arthur to the teeth with alien technology, Merlin realized a vital problem. A powerful king with fancy toys is nothing if he's surrounded by a bunch of brainless thugs. You can't build a golden age if your subordinates only know how to drink wine and bash each other's heads with maces. So, Merlin began his new role, social architect. He decided to perform the largest-scale brainwashing in medieval history, turning crude military comrades into gallant knights of the Round Table. You think the Round Table was just a circular table for sitting and having fun? Wrong. It was a psychological tool. It erased hierarchy, creating the illusion of equality, making these ego-driven men feel like part of something greater. But to maintain that illusion, Merlin had to be a strict headmaster. His educational program didn't just include sword dancing. It was a bizarre blend of theology, natural philosophy, and strategic thinking. Merlin understood, if you want to control a monster, you must give it an operating system called morality. Let's look at how he trained the three brightest stars of the Round Table to see the wizard's cunning. First is Sir Gawain. This guy had quite an interesting bug. His strength waxed and waned with the solar cycle. Weak in the early morning, strong as a god at noon, and deflating at night. Instead of calling it a curse, Merlin taught Gawain how to hack his own body. He taught Gawain to recognize his biological rhythms, scheduling actions for the peak hours of energy and conserving strength when the sun set. This wasn't just military tactics, it was karma management. Merlin turned an impulsive man into a disciplined warrior who knew how to wait for the right moment. Next is Sir Percival. If Gawain was a muscle man, Percival was a sensitive, spiritual child. Merlin saw a potential in Percival that others didn't, the ability to see through other realms of reality. Instead of teaching him how to hack people, Merlin threw him into the deep forest for solitary meditation exercises. He taught Percival to distinguish between divine revelations and demonic hallucinations. Merlin was training a spiritual commando, someone who would eventually be strong enough to touch the Holy Grail, a calculated long-term move. And then we have Lancelot, Merlin's biggest headache. Lancelot was too good, too handsome, and too enthusiastic. Merlin knew full well that Lancelot's burning passion for Queen Guinevere would be the fire that burned Camelot down. So what did the wizard do? Stop it? No. Merlin was too smart for such a crude move. He tried to sublimate that earthly lust into divine love. He made Lancelot study complex theological texts, trying to convince the guy that serving the king and God was the pinnacle of emotion. Merlin tried to turn a lovesick man into a living saint. Spoiler. This was one of the few times Merlin failed. But we'll talk about that bitter end later. But Merlin's greatest achievement wasn't an individual, it was the chivalric code. Imagine an era where the strong had the right to kill anyone they hated. Merlin appeared and said, "No, you must protect the weak, respect women, and be kind to peasants." Why? Out of kindness? Only partially. The real reason was to maintain the system. If knights kept robbing peasants, who would grow the rice for them to eat? If they kept killing each other, who would protect the borders from the Saxons? Merlin cleverly embedded Christian virtues into Celtic honor to create a new type of social contract. He redefined courage. It wasn't about how many people you killed, but whether you dared to stand up for justice even when it was to your own disadvantage. Merlin even intervened in the legal system. He introduced reforms where justice wasn't just punishment, but soul salvation. He established trial procedures based on both factual evidence and supernatural performances that only he had the right to interpret. You see, Merlin turned Camelot into a utopia, a perfect world on paper. He created libraries, patronized the arts, and built schools to spread this knightly ideology to future generations. Merlin wanted Camelot not just to be a kingdom, but a symbol of civilization amidst the dark medieval night. But there is an ironic truth. The more he tried to create perfection, the more clearly Merlin saw the cracks. He taught the knights to seek the Holy Grail, an ultimate spiritual adventure, but he also knew that very journey would drain Camelot's strength. Why did Merlin push his pawns into danger? Was he too confident? Or did he know that destiny is something that cannot be changed by any moral lesson? Hold your oars tight, because in the next part, we will enter Merlin's darkest prophecies, where this perfect kingdom begins to rot from within. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to watch the house you painstakingly built be burned to the ground, yet you still have to continue painting it every day? That is the tragedy of Merlin. While all of Camelot was basking in the intoxication of victory, Merlin saw the corpses on the misty fields. He was not just a prophet, he was a prisoner of his own visions. And the final project he pushed the knights into, the quest for the Holy Grail, was actually a suicide test. Merlin knew the Holy Grail was not just an ancient cup. It was a divine reality, a type of frequency that only extremely pure souls could receive. But here was the trap. To find it, the best knights had to leave Camelot. Look at the price of holiness. Camelot suffered a severe brain drain. The strongest swords, the clearest heads all departed, leaving behind an empty kingdom for enemies to eye. Merlin prophesied that this quest was the pinnacle of chivalry, but also the end of its practical existence. He knew that perfection could not exist in an imperfect world. And then, the rotten seeds began to sprout right at the foot of the throne. First was Lancelot. Merlin foresaw a maddening irony. The very quality that made Lancelot great, absolute devotion, was the thing that tore the Round Table apart. His commitment to Guinevere was no longer a romance. It was a political black hole. It created envy, divided loyalties, and turned brothers into enemies. Merlin saw it, warned of it, but fate is a stubborn fellow who refuses to listen. But the true villain in Merlin's nightmare was not some dark sorcerer. It was Mordred. Mordred was the embodiment of Arthur's past mistakes. This illegitimate son did not just come to claim the throne. He came to prove that the order Merlin built was merely a sandcastle. Merlin's prophecy loomed chillingly. Mordred would use the very network of lies and political grievances to gather the discontented, shake hands with the Saxons, and deliver a fatal blow to the heart of Britain. And then, the most horrific moment arrived, the Battle of Camelot. Imagine a field flooded with fog and blood. The sound of clashing swords was no longer the sound of glory, but the screams of a dying civilization. Merlin saw through his crystal ball. Arthur dealt a finishing blow to Mordred, but at the same time the son's blade pierced the father's chest. A perfect mutual destruction. There were no winners, only ruins. Many say Arthur died, but Merlin, with his characteristic mystery, left behind a prophecy full of hope or full of obsession. Avalon. He saw the wounded king being taken to that mystical island where supernatural healing arts keep Arthur alive forever in a waiting state. The once and future king, a promise that when Britain needs him most, he will return. But to me, Zorro, that feels more like a permanent suspension than a hope. After Arthur left, everything Merlin built collapsed like dominoes. The Saxons poured in like a flood, sweeping away Romano-British institutions, erasing the glamorous chivalric codes. Britain fell into the darkness of foreign occupation. All of this was recorded by Merlin in the work Prophetia Merlini. He used symbolic language to hide the pain. The ox, Arthur, falls. The pack of wolves, Saxons, tears the kingdom apart, and the red dragon is overwhelmed by the white dragon. Is that the end? Would a genius brain like Merlin accept such a tragic conclusion? Not quite. Because Merlin had one last hand to play, an ending that even death could not touch. Prepare yourselves, because in the final part, we will discover the mystery of Merlin's own disappearance, and how he turned himself into an immortal legend, a ghost that still haunts history to this day. So, we have witnessed Camelot fall, Arthur vanish into the mists of Avalon, and the Round Table become nothing but rotting pieces of wood. Do you think Merlin failed? If you look at the numbers, kingdom lost, army disbanded, Saxon occupation, the answer is yes. But look a little deeper into the darkness. Merlin never played a short-term game. He was a player who played chess with time itself, and his strongest piece was not Excalibur, but the story. After Arthur left, Merlin also gradually faded from the actual pages of history to step into the world of mysterious prophecies. His work Prophetia Merlini was not just a book predicting the future. It was a type of thought virus implanted into the brain of Western civilization. He used an extremely cunning symbolic language to describe history. In Merlin's world, humans were not just flesh and bone, they were spirit animals. The ox, Arthur, represents fierce protective strength and the ancient sovereignty of the Britons. The dragon, sovereignty, symbolizes ultimate power, always burning but also full of danger. The wolf, Saxon, brutal invaders, bringing destruction, but also the inevitable change of the timeline. Why use symbols? Because Merlin understood that crude truth would be forgotten, but symbols are immortal. He turned British history into a cycle of reincarnation, where collapse was merely the preparation for another rise. That was how he controlled the psychology of an entire nation for centuries after he vanished. But here is the real plot twist Merlin saved for us: the birth of the real-life heartthrob. Did you know that the entire concept of a gentleman, of courtly love, and the polite behavior we still praise today was actually a side effect of Merlin's educational program? The emphasis on refined behavior, spiritual development, and the proper relationship between love and duty provided material for poets and storytellers who transformed these practical teachings into elaborate literary conventions. In other words, Merlin turned the internal conflict management skills of the Round Table into a type of elite culture. His efforts to restrain the wild instincts of Lancelot or Gawain inadvertently created the template for romantic knights in literature. Merlin didn't just teach them how to hold a sword, he taught them how to become cultured entities. Camelot may have been lost on the map, but it won on the pages of books and in the codes of human conduct. Look back at the whole process. Politics. He created a king from nothing. Technology. He forged Excalibur and the supernatural surveillance system. Society. He established the Round Table and the chivalric code to control violence. Spirituality. He pushed the knights to find the Holy Grail to test human limits. Finally, when everything shattered, what did Merlin do? He didn't try to rebuild Camelot with bricks and stones. He built it with myth. Merlin's prophetic clairvoyance told him that humans need a perfect model to strive for, even if they can never reach it. Camelot was a failed utopia, but it was that very tragic failure that made it an eternal inspiration. Merlin succeeded in turning himself into history's greatest puppeteer, a ghost in the library, a whisper in the mists of Avalon, one who is still laughing at us from the pages of medieval manuscripts. Arthur may be the once and future king, but Merlin is the one who holds the key to that future. He knew that we would always crave a just world, a loyal brotherhood, and a miracle to solve life's troubles. And as long as humans still crave those things, Merlin still exists. So, the final question for you. If you knew for certain that all your efforts would collapse, would you choose to do as Merlin did, build something so brilliant that even its ashes are enough to warm thousands of years to come? Next, we won't be talking about fire-breathing dragons or knights saving princesses in fairy tales. We will dissect something much more realistic and terrifying: power. And the person holding the key to the power code of the Middle Ages was none other than Merlin. But forget the image of a kind, white-bearded old man in Disney movies. The Merlin I want to introduce to you is a genius political architect, one who sees through the future with a gaze so sharp, it's almost bitter. For the political theorists of that time, his prophecies were not entertainment literature. They were a framework for understanding divine mandate and governance. Have you ever wondered why the greatest empires eventually collapse into the mire of corruption? Merlin saw that thousands of years ago. In his visions, he revealed an ironic truth. Every political institution, no matter how virtuous or efficient it is initially, carries within it the pathogen of corruption and decay. Power is not a silent crown. It is a living entity that always seeks to destroy itself. Merlin did not believe in a permanent golden age. He believed in cyclical patterns. A kingdom rises, prospers, then rots from within, and can only be saved through periodic, and often painful, renewals and reforms. Medieval kings looked at this and understood. Their throne was just a temporary rental from destiny. If they could not maintain moral qualities, that contract would be canceled immediately. Look at the map of Britain at that time. The Anglo-Saxons were triumphant after driving out the native Britons. They thought they were the masters of the island. But Merlin, with an ironic smile, saw the sails from across the channel. The Normans were coming. This was not just a change of name on the throne. Merlin predicted a systemic change: superior military discipline. Norman warriors did not fight by instinct. They were organized war machines. Centralized administration. The Normans brought tighter government structures, turning scattered local customs into a rigid and efficient legal system. What was the irony here? The very Anglo-Saxons who once seized the land of the ancient Britons were now being swallowed by the Normans in exactly that same way. Merlin called it cultural transfer through destruction. Each wave of conquest brought a new breath, but at the same time wiped out the old legacies. Merlin foresaw the way the Norman administrative system would recalibrate the entire backbone of Britain. Economically and organizationally, excellent. But spiritually, it was a disaster. Every stone the Normans laid, every law they wrote was a knife cut into the ancient Celtic heritage, the thing King Arthur shed blood to preserve. Merlin saw a future where the legends of the Round Table were covered by the dust of continental European institutions. Earthly power, according to Merlin, is a game of trade-offs. You get stability and wealth, but you lose identity and roots. If you think history is only written in blood on fields full of corpses, then Merlin would laugh in your face. In this part, I will show you how this wizard's visions read the future of Britain in such a sophisticated way, from plots in the bedroom to intellectual battles in dark monasteries. Merlin saw a Britain unified under a single crown. But listen, it didn't happen in the glorious winner-takes-all style of Arthur's time. Instead, he predicted a more mature approach, or to put it bluntly, one that was chillingly pragmatic. This reunification would take place through marital alliances and diplomatic negotiations. Instead of swinging swords, people swung marriage contracts. Merlin foresaw a future where kingdoms were no longer flattened by horses' hooves, but merged by political kisses. An integration colored by compromise, where power was shared at the banquet table instead of being seized on the battlefield. In Merlin's world, religion was not just the sound of church bells in the morning. It was a massive chessboard of power. He foresaw the religious transformations that would reshape Britain's spirituality. His prophecies, though covered under layers of bizarre symbolic language, revealed dramatic periods of religious conflict. It was an endless duel between religious and secular authorities. Who was the true master of the masses' loyalty? The king or the pope? Merlin saw that ecclesiastical institutions would be strengthened through these very trials of faith and painful reforms. Faith is a type of weapon, and whoever holds the hilt of that weapon will hold the entire kingdom. That is the hidden message that I, Zorro, read from Merlin. This is my favorite part. Amidst the invasions of the Saxons or Normans, Merlin paid special attention to the role of scholarship. He saw monastic communities and cathedral schools serving as repositories of ancient knowledge. When war swept through burning cities, it was the ink-stained hands of monks who silently transcribed the ideals of the Round Table and Arthur's achievements. They were the guardians of the continuity of British culture through centuries of disruption. Merlin understood, if you want to destroy a people, burn their books. But if knowledge remains, that people will be reborn. There is an ironic truth. Later generations of leaders used Merlin's prophecies as a propaganda tool. Rulers sought to identify themselves with positive figures in his visions to legitimize their thrones. They used negative prophecies to defame, turning enemies into demons that had been foretold. Scholars of that time created thick commentaries just to decode Merlin, but in reality, it was to steer their meaning to fit the pockets and ambitions of the nobility. The nobles liked to hear about succession, while the commoners, they only cared about natural disasters and the price of bread. Things Merlin didn't forget to mention either. Merlin's vision didn't stop at London. He looked toward Ireland, Scotland, and especially Wales. He predicted Wales would be a cathedral, preserving ancient British customs and laws the longest. While other regions were Normanized, Wales still held the link to the pre-Saxon era. Merlin foresaw the final restoration of native sovereignty, a rise from the borderlands to remind the world that Arthur's blood has never gone cold. Step into the forest of Brocéliande, where the boundary between reality and illusion is as thin as a hair. This is where Merlin met the destiny of his life, a woman history calls by many names, Nimue, Viviane, or the Lady of the Lake. Don't you find it ironic? A man who can see through thousands of years of history, accurately predicting the fall of empires, is completely blind to his own love. Merlin, after centuries of living celibate to serve the sovereignty, fell into the web of love with Viviane, a young girl of outstanding intelligence and an intense curiosity for magic. For medieval authors, this was not just a romance, it was the fall of intellect before passion. Merlin's prophetic ability, usually so sharp in military and politics, suddenly lost its signal when applied to this personal relationship. Destiny seemed to have deliberately installed a blind spot to lead him to his doom. Imagine Merlin as a brilliant university professor and Vivienne as a genius student. Merlin was so infatuated with her that he brought out his entire treasure of knowledge accumulated over thousands of years to give to her. This educational process was divided into levels that I call Merlin's suicide curriculum. Basic level, natural philosophy and astronomy. He taught her how to control the four elements: fire, water, earth, and air. Advanced level, prophetic techniques and mental discipline. He taught her how to achieve supernatural states of consciousness through meditation amidst wild forests. Death level, binding spells and coercive charms. These were things Merlin was extremely restricted in using because they were too dangerous and easily corrupted the soul. But because he loved her too much, he handed her his own nuclear codes. Vivienne, or Nimue in Mallory's version, was not an innocent student. She was a strategist. She understood that in a world of men and swords, magical knowledge was the only ticket to absolute independence and power. Merlin's final fall took place in different ways, depending on the sources, but all carry a tragic and allegorical color. The Crystal Cave. Merlin was locked in a crystal prison. He could see everything outside but could not touch, could not act. A bitter irony for a prophet, to see all but be unable to do anything. The Hawthorn Tree. According to Celtic tradition, the hawthorn tree is the gateway to the fairy world. Merlin was imprisoned in the foliage, turning him into part of the natural cycle of life and death, a form of supernatural hibernation. The doorless tower, a vertical structure separating him from the world. It was like a forced monastery, where wisdom was completely isolated from reality. The greatest irony of history is when you are shackled by the very chains you forged yourself and taught others how to use. Why is this story important? Because it reflects the deep fears of medieval society regarding women's intelligence. Nimue embodies a new type of powerful woman, one who doesn't need to use muscle, only cunning and intellect to outwit the most powerful man. Authors of that time often attributed a moral ambiguity to Nimue. Was she evil? Perhaps not. She was simply carrying out an intellectual coup to protect her own freedom from the control of an old and obsessed wizard. Merlin's disappearance left a deadly void at Arthur's court. Without the advisor, without the early warnings, the round table began to wobble before the coming storms. In the 13th century, the French decided that Merlin needed a new look, more elegant, more Christian, and more systematic. They created the Vulgate cycle, a literary blockbuster so massive that it overshadowed everything that came before it. Here, Merlin is not merely a sorcerer, he is a character in God's plan for redemption. The clerical authors did something incredibly bold. They kept his half-human, half-demon origins, but turned it into a story about choice. Imagine it. You are born with demon blood in your veins, but you use that diabolical intellect to serve the heavens. It is a dramatic inner struggle, a sharp message about free will that I, Zorro, bet is still relevant to this day. Did you think Camelot was just a stone castle? No. Through the pens of the French, it was a masterpiece of technology and magic designed by Merlin. He didn't just teach Arthur how to fight battles. He taught the young king about military strategy, diplomatic negotiation, and spiritual discipline. Merlin in this phase was like the CEO of the kingdom. Most notable was the Round Table. Merlin didn't just build a wooden table. He used symbolic geometry, to create an artifact capable of binding the most rebellious personalities into a spiritual brotherhood. The circle has no beginning and no end, just as ideal power must be absolute justice. Merlin used mathematics to teach the knights about morality. A real slick operator, wasn't he? As Merlin traveled to other lands, he was immediately localized. In Germany, Merlin became a master of individual quests. The Germans didn't care much for Arthur's royal politics. They loved deep spiritual journeys. Merlin here was like a guru, guiding knights to face their destiny and unshakable cosmic forces. In Italy, Merlin embodied a Roman scholar. The Italians, proud of their classical heritage, turned Merlin into a researcher of ancient texts, a sophisticated Machiavellian political advisor. Here, his magic wasn't random spells, but the crystallization of philosophical knowledge and refined statecraft. This is the real, dark history. The evolution of Merlin reflects the very changes in medieval society. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe witnessed the rise of universities, professional legal systems, and complex administrative apparatuses. Kings no longer needed warriors who were just brawn and no brains. They needed learned advisors. Merlin is the prototype of this class. He is the mirror image of the educated clergy and professional administrators, the people who held power not with swords, but with information and analysis. Merlin showed that the true master of the kingdom is not the person sitting on the throne, but the person standing behind it, whispering prophecies into the king's ear. But history always has a bitter end. By the end of the Middle Ages, the optimism vanished. Constant warfare and the collapse of feudal systems blackened Merlin's image. The post-Vulgate cycle presents a helpless Merlin. All his magic, all his prophecies, and all his wisdom could not prevent the corruption and decay of the Round Table. Merlin was imprisoned, and Arthur's kingdom shattered. Why? Because knowledge without control, or supernatural power accompanied by blind passion, eventually leads to self-destruction. Merlin is an eternal warning about human limits. Even if you can see through the future, you may not necessarily be able to change the human heart. You know, when people think of Merlin, the crowd usually imagines an old man with a beard touching the ground, wearing a sparkling blue robe, standing and casting spells in those Disney cartoons. But let me splash a bucket of cold water on that daydream. The original Merlin was not that cute. In fact, he was the product of a transnational, centuries-long rebranding campaign, molded by the hands of prophet-seekers and the most prominent politicians of the Middle Ages. Let's go back in time to the first manuscripts. Merlin didn't initially appear to help the poor or grant miracles to the commoners. No, he started his career as a super advisor for the elite. In the world of early medieval literature, if you didn't have noble blood flowing in you, you were basically invisible. The writers of that time understood very well who was paying them. It was the kings and the nobility. Therefore, they built Merlin as a symbol of knowledge serving sovereignty. He was the shadow behind the throne, the one whispering prophecies into the ears of kings to help them stabilize their empires. Merlin at this point was not our friend. He was a political tool, a testament to the fact that supernatural knowledge was reserved exclusively for the ruling class. But society changed, and the literary market had to pivot. When the merchant class and the urban middle class began to have money and knew how to read, Merlin suddenly became democratized in a strange way. Later manuscripts began to depict Merlin chatting with merchants or helping commoners. Don't mistake this for humanity. It was simply the way authors of that time pulled views from this emerging customer group. A pragmatic compromise that I call literary opportunism. You think Merlin is a specialty of Britain? Wrong. Merlin is a cultural virus, capable of incredible adaptation and mutation as it spread across Europe. In Spain, when Merlin set foot on the Iberian Peninsula, he was no longer a pure Celtic monk or sorcerer. Spanish writers smeared onto this character layers of Islamic philosophy and the intense religious conflicts of that land. Merlin here became a dialogue seeker between faiths, a complex entity reflecting the dramatic cultural blending of Iberian society at that time. In Scandinavia, in the freezing north where the ghosts of Odin and Thor still lingered, Merlin donned the cloak of Norse mythology. He wasn't just a wizard, he was the keeper of ancient secrets of the frozen land, a character with a psychological structure close to the wild northern kingdoms. This expansion reveals an ironic truth. Merlin is like a lump of clay that each nation, each era, molded into the shape they wanted to serve their own political ambitions. And this is the part I like best: the history fakers. The Merlin legend didn't evolve naturally. It was refined through the hands of copyists, illustrators, and medieval editors. Imagine a dark room, reeking of ink and leather, where copyists were working diligently. They didn't just copy words, they edited. A little change in language here, a sharper illustration there, or even adding entirely new plot points to please the lord who was sponsoring them. They were the original content creators, and they transformed Merlin from a crazed prophet in the deep forests of Wales into the wise, dignified wizard model we see today. It was a cross-temporal collaborative process where the truth was bent to create an immortal brand. Merlin became a template, the perfect combination of supernatural wisdom and earthly governance. He is proof that if you possess knowledge that others do not, you are not just a wizard. You are the game controller. But what is the price of that power? And how could someone with demonic origins become a symbol of Christian wisdom? The answer lies in the cognitive transformation that I will reveal right now, if you still have enough courage to step further into the darkness. Do you know what the most ridiculous thing about the Middle Ages was? It was the thin line between a scientist and a devil worshipper. If you knew too much about the stars or how to cure diseases with herbs, congratulations, you were standing with one foot in the furnace. But Merlin? He was a cunning exception. He pulled off the most spectacular trick in history, turning magic into a serious field of scientific research. Look at Merlin's brain. Authors of that time didn't build him as some guy muttering meaningless incantations. Instead, they turned him into a magus, a master of natural philosophy, astronomy, and classical texts. In the eyes of the medieval audience, true wisdom wasn't just bookish erudition. It had to have something a bit goosebump-inducing. Merlin perfectly combined the skills of a scholar and the prophetic ability inherited from his father, an incubus, dream demon. This was a tactical move by the writers. They wanted Merlin to look intellectually legitimate, so the theologians wouldn't come after him, but still powerful enough to do the impossible. Merlin's magic was not an arbitrary violation of natural laws. Oh no. He introduced it as an extension of academic study. To the average person, moving the giant stones at Stonehenge was magic, but to Merlin it was just advanced mechanics. This approach inadvertently stimulated the development of medieval science and philosophy. It suggested to us that this world has hidden principles, and if you are smart enough to study them, you will look like a god in the eyes of fools. Forget about knights with swords charging at each other. The real battle lay in the dark rooms where Merlin gave advice to Arthur. Merlin is the ancestral model for bureaucrats, professional advisors, and modern spin doctors. He embodied an ambitious ideal, an intellectual who could guide an entire empire without sitting on the throne. Merlin's advice often went against the will of the crowd, even the king's own preferences. Why? Because he possessed something politicians always crave, but rarely have: moral integrity based on superior knowledge. This model strongly influenced European administrative systems. Courts began to realize they needed educated eggheads to manage complex administrative machines. Merlin proved that theoretical knowledge could be fully applied to political practice without losing the mystery of power. He was the original influencer, the person who kept the wheels of history on track with whispers instead of slashes. But history always has a way of mocking those who think they are the wisest. Merlin could see through the fate of kingdoms, but was blind to his own heart. By the Renaissance, writers began to exploit this tragic side. Merlin loved Nimue, or Viviane, a young and ambitious girl. He was so infatuated with her that he was willing to teach her all his magical secrets. And the result? She used those very spells to imprison him forever in a stone cave or an oak tree. This is not just a cheap romance story. This is a profound cautionary lesson about intellectual pride. It shows that even the most extraordinary individuals are still subject to human limitations. You can be the architect of a kingdom. You can be a seer of the future. But if you don't control your personal weaknesses, your knowledge will become the grave that buries you. Merlin's fate echoed in later works, from Shakespeare's Prospero to modern wizards. It poses a piercing question: is knowledge power, or is knowledge a tragic burden? Merlin narrowed the gap between the divine and the human, only to realize that the gap is where the most horrific tragedies are born. Welcome to the Merlin multiverse. Don't think only Marvel knows how to make movies about different timelines. Since the Middle Ages, European nations have been competing to cook up Merlin to turn him into a symbol that fit their national tastes. And believe me, these versions are much darker and more mind-bending than the original. First, look over at Germany. Here they weren't very keen on wizards flying around on brooms. They liked something more realistic and heavy. Merlin was transformed into the figure of the Meisters, masters, in the folk books, Volksbuch. The Germans pumped into Merlin an intense focus on individual spiritual development and harsh moral choices. Why? Because it was the era of Lutheranism. They needed a Merlin who not only knew how to cast spells, but also knew how to struggle with the inner self and establish a personal relationship with God, even if his origins were a bit diabolical. Merlin in Germany was more like an ascetic philosopher than a court sorcerer. Meanwhile, in Italy, the land of glamour and intrigue, Merlin transformed into characters like Atlante in the work Orlando Furioso. The Italians, obsessed with classical Roman culture, mixed medieval magic with Greco-Roman mythology. The Italian version of Merlin was not just an advisor, he was the architect of labyrinths of illusions, the manipulator of reality to solve the thorny political problems of the Italian city-states. A combination of scholarly erudition and characteristic Machiavellian cunning. Have you ever wondered why modern politicians always have a powerful team of advisors behind them? Thank or curse Merlin for that. His reputation created a gold standard for real royal advisors. In those days, if you wanted to be an advisor to the king, you couldn't just be a flatterer. You had to prove you had scholarly erudition, integrity, at least in form, and especially the ability to stand independent of factions and wings. Kings began to look for living Merlins, educated administrators who could combine book theory with the brutal practical experience of the political arena. Merlin was the one who laid the foundation for the political theory of wise counsel. He was the living proof in literature that even the greatest king like Arthur would become a fool without a superior intellect to lead the way. This inadvertently helped educated administrators have an increasing voice in the state apparatus, transforming government from a bunch of soldiers holding swords into a sophisticated administrative system. Let's talk about Merlin's prophecies. They were not harmless weather forecasts. To the medieval audience, it was how they understood divine providence. When Merlin predicted the rise and fall of kingdoms, he was giving the audience a telescope to see through the flow of history. People no longer looked at political events as random accidents. Thanks to Merlin, every fluctuation was part of a grand cosmic plan. This was an extremely effective psychological manipulation tool. If you wanted the people to accept a military defeat or a change of throne, just say, "Merlin prophesied that 100 years ago." And here is the most dramatic part. Medieval theologians had a chronic headache because of Merlin. How could someone born from the rape of a demon be a good person? How could his magic serve God's purpose? They turned Merlin into a lab rat for debates on free will and grace. If Merlin could overcome his dark origins to become a tool of righteousness, then surely no one is predestined to be evil. Scholars had to build extremely complex analytical systems to distinguish between orthodox prophecy and demonic deception. Merlin was the landmark that helped them redefine the relationship between natural and supernatural forces. He forced the church to acknowledge that sometimes light can come from the darkest places, and human wisdom can harmonize seemingly impossible things. But be careful, because when a wizard begins to become too holy, that is also when real-life practitioners of magic begin to exploit his name to carry out their own crazy personal ambitions. Welcome to the final stage of this rabbit hole. If you think Merlin only stops at dusty, hand-copied manuscripts, you are dead wrong. When Gutenberg's printing press began to roar across Europe, the Merlin brand was not killed off. On the contrary, it was repackaged, mass-produced, and became a real craze. But this time, magic no longer lay in vague prophecies. It stepped out into real life, embodying living human beings. Let me introduce you to a character, John Dee. If you lived in the time of Elizabeth I, you would see him as the real-life version of Merlin. Dee was not only a brilliant mathematician and astronomer, he was also obsessed with communicating with angels and searching for the philosopher's stone. Why do I mention Dee? Because he is living proof of how the Merlin myth bent the thinking of the intelligentsia. Like Merlin, Dee perfectly combined scholarly erudition and magical practice. He did not consider magic to be heresy. He considered it natural magic, a high-level scientific discipline to understand and manipulate the forces of the universe. Renaissance mages looked at Merlin and saw a historical precedent. They believed that if Merlin could build an entire kingdom with wisdom and power, then they too could help their monarchs dominate the world with science and occultism. This was a dangerous game of thrones, where the line between a genius and a madman was only a nod from the king away. When the printing press appeared, Merlin faced a turning point: standardization. Previously, each region had its own version of Merlin, as I told you in part 1. But when printers began releasing mass editions, they needed a standard version to sell to the most people. However, don't think they just copied it exactly. Early modern publishers were masters of marketing. They edited, added, and reshaped the story of Merlin to fit the tastes of contemporary readers. Merlin at this point became an educational model. On governance, he taught kings how to lead ethically. On morality, he was a warning about pride. On career, he was an example of turning theoretical knowledge into social benefit. In the schools and universities of that time, the story of Merlin was used as a case study on how to be an intellectual useful to the nation without being corrupted by greed or personal ambition. A kind of soft skill for the elite of that time, you see. But no matter how powerful, Merlin still could not escape his own trap. His downfall at the hands of Nimue, his lover and also his student, is the most tragic conclusion history reserves for those who hold too many secrets. For the Renaissance audience, this was not just a sad love story. It was a profound reflection on human limits. You can be the architect of Camelot, you can control the stars, but you are still just a creature of flesh and blood with fatal weaknesses. The fascination with Merlin is the fascination with ourselves. Those who always crave divine power but are shackled by mundane emotions. The legend of Merlin is not just the story of a wizard. It is a map of the aspirations and fears of an entire civilization at the threshold of knowledge. Zorro. From a wild Welsh prophet, Merlin has transformed into a universal archetype. He is the predecessor of Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, of Dumbledore in Harry Potter, and of every wise advisor in popular culture today. Merlin's legacy is a stark reminder that knowledge always comes with moral responsibility. If you have the power to change the world, but not the wisdom to control yourself, you will end up in an eternal oak hollow just like him. Merlin is a symbol of the intersection between tradition and innovation, between spiritual authority and secular power. He represents the highest capacity of humans, but simultaneously serves as a testament to our most bitter limitations. So, next time you see a long-bearded wizard on the screen, don't just look at his magic wand. Look at the political layers, the theological debates, and the historical plots that molded that character. Because in the shadows of history, Merlin never actually performed magic. He was simply someone who knew how to manipulate reality with his dark wisdom. And that is all for today's story. I am Zorro, and this is Dark History. See you in the next hidden corners of history, where the truth is always stranger and more brutal than any fiction.